In this episode, we'll take a look at the new compressor settings in the Rodecaster Pro with version 2.1 firmware update. This is the latest firmware as of this recording in June 2020, and it's allowed you much greater access to some of the effects in here, so you can really fine-tune them, and they sound a lot better, to be honest, as well. Now, before we jump into that, why use a compressor? So the idea with a compressor here on the Rodecaster Pro, for the kind of uses you'd typically be using the Rodecaster Pro for, recording podcasts, maybe live streaming, things of that nature, is really kind of to level out the overall audio and make the overall loudness of your audio consistent. So the idea is really to make it a lot easier on your listeners so they don't have to constantly be on the volume dial trying to get to a level that's comfortable for them to listen to you. And that's really what a compressor will allow you to do. Now, it's important to understand, and I think most of us know this intuitively, a lot of times people are listening to podcasts in less than ideal situations in terms of listening environments. They're listening in cars, airplanes, trains, subways, other noisy places. They're using earbuds and other kind of mediocre playback devices. So it's really important that they get a nice, consistent, strong, present signal, and the compressor will allow us to do that. Now, first of all, there are some settings I would recommend you check here before we get into the compressor, just to make it easier for yourself and make sure that you're able to hear the changes that we're making. So we'll come here into the gear menu. We'll go to Advanced. We will go to Audio and then Processing. First of all, we need to make sure that the Effects Edit mode is turned on. So you can just tap on there, make sure it's on with the blue. We can come back out. Next up, we want to make sure we get the good meters. So you can see here, if I come out here, these meters actually have numbers on them that tell you how loud your audio is. The numbers refer to dB full scale. And for example, the 15 here refers to minus 15 dB, so on and so forth. So we'll come back in here to Advanced, to Audio, and we will go to Operations. And we want to make sure that the broadcast meters are turned on. Again, you can just tap that here to turn it on, make sure it's blue and on. That'll just make things a little bit easier. Next up, we'll come back out to the Advanced menu. So if we come here, Advanced, come into Headphones, I would make sure that this Limit Maximum Volume is turned off. That will affect what you're hearing, and it's not helpful in this particular circumstance. Now, if for some reason you want to turn that on later, that's fine once you get the compressor set up, but it's going to really kind of throw things for a loop. I originally had this on and I was like, oh man, this compressor sounds horrible. Turns out I just had this setting on. Make sure that's off. All right, there is one other thing you may want to do here, and let's just come out here. If I come in again to Menu, Advanced, and in this case to Audio and Multitrack, I may want to turn on this post fader here. So the post fader makes sure that all of these effects that you're setting up here, and in this case the compressor, will also be recorded. So if you want to bake this into the audio file, if you want the compressor to be part of the audio recorded, make sure you turn on that post fader. Okay, now once we've done all that, we are ready to get our compressor set up. I should also mention here, there are a couple of different ways to navigate the menus now with the new firmware. If I want to go out of the menus, I can just swipe up, or if I swipe down, that'll take me back to the menu I was in. So a little bit quicker to get around if you need to do that. Now, once we have all that set up, we're ready to jump in and start setting up our compressor. So I'm going to go ahead and press the channel button. We're just going to set the compressor for this first input here, my microphone, and that's what you're hearing right now. So I click on that. Now, of course, first we need to get our level set appropriately, and you can see here, I'm using a Rode NT1, so it's a condenser microphone, so I have phantom power turned on. If you're using a dynamic microphone, you'll want to turn phantom power off. Then I'll go ahead and set the level so that my peaks are hitting somewhere within these green lines here. In this case, I found that 30 is the right setting. Now, you might ask, well, what setting should I use? Well, talk into your microphone, increase the setting until your peaks are hitting in between these green lines, preferably a little closer to the top. That's what settings are for. There's no such thing as the right settings for every microphone. It has to do with people's voices as well, how close you are to the microphone, so on and so forth. So in this case, we found that 30 worked pretty well. Come back out. Now, you can come in here and actually could do this before you set the level. If you press one of these presets here, all it's doing is setting the input level for you as initial setting, but you have to kind of fine tune it for your situation anyway. and it will either turn on phantom power or not turn on phantom power, depending on which microphone you choose here. If your microphone's not listed here, you need to find out if you're using a condenser microphone or a dynamic microphone, and just select one of those instead. The only difference really is if you press condenser, it'll turn on the phantom power. If you press dynamic, it won't turn on the phantom power. And then finally, we get to come into audio processing, and let's go to our compressor. All right. Now, here's where the magic happens. I'm going to go ahead and turn the compressor off. So there's a little switch up here to turn that off. Now it's off, and you're hearing this again, remember, exactly what we're doing here. So you may need to adjust your volume a little bit here, but I'm doing that specifically in this case because I want you to be able to hear all the changes that we're making. Now, I may have to turn up my volume just a little bit here. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand what these meters on the right-hand side tell us. The sort of green-blue is your input level, and so you can see we're peaking somewhere right around minus 15 dB. And then the next one over is the kind of yellow-green one. That is our output level. You can see they're exactly the same right now. That's because we're not using the compressor. It's turned off. And then the next one actually shows the amount of gain reduction that the compressor is applying at any given moment in time. And it actually comes from the top, and it's a red bar. You'll see that in just a minute. Now, if at any time things get muddled up, things are starting to sound horrible, you're not sure what you did, and you feel like you messed it up, you can always press this back arrow here, and that'll take you back to some default settings or your previous settings. So not a horrible thing. You can always get out by pressing the back arrow. Okay, let's go ahead and turn the compressor on. Now we have the compressor turned on. Again, you may have to adjust your volume a little bit. Now we have a variety of settings here. And actually, before we go into the settings, you can see our compressor is doing a little bit of compression. Not a whole lot, because we don't want to do a whole lot with dialogue. We just want to really kind of manage those peaks that are sticking out a little bit so that we can bring our overall levels up some. And that's really what's happening here. You can see it's just kind of tickling the compressor, as I like to say. That is to say, it's only engaging it a little bit every once in a while in between words, or from one word to the next. Generally, it's going to be the consonants, the harder kind of sounds that it's compressing. So with that, let's talk about each of these settings and how you can fine-tune it for your particular microphone, your particular voice, so on and so forth. Now, first of all, we have the threshold. And what the threshold does on a compressor is it's basically a line. So when the audio goes above that level, that overall amplitude, which is represented here in decibels, as soon as the audio goes above that line, the compressor kicks in and starts working. Okay. Now remember, the decibel scale tops out at 0 dB, and then it goes down from there. So if you hit the audio, if the audio hits 0 dB, it's going to clip and distort and sound awful. So that's part of what we're trying to accomplish here with the compressor is keep those peaks from getting up to 0 dB. And if I control them enough, if I bring them down just enough, then I can bring the overall level of the audio up altogether. So that threshold defines when the compressor starts kicking in. When the audio gets to that decibel level, then it starts to engage. Next up, we go to ratio, and ratio defines how much compression is applied once the audio gets above that threshold. In this case, I have it set to 3:1. It's almost always a ratio on most compressors, and here, certainly, it can go down to 1:1 or all the way up to 10:1. Okay, and the way this works, I'm going to go ahead and put it at 3. That's generally about the area I will put it for dialogue, because again, I don't want to squash the dialogue, but I want to control it just a little bit. So the idea here is that once audio goes above the threshold, say it goes 3 dB above the threshold, what this ratio says is for every 3 dB above the threshold, I want the compressor to kind of squash that down to just 1 decibel above the threshold. That's what a 3:1 ratio means. Likewise, if you go above the threshold by 6 dB, it'll kind of squash that down so that it's 2 dB over the threshold. And likewise, if you go 9 decibels over the threshold, it'll squash that down to 3 decibels over the threshold. So you can see how that works. So it's how much compression you're doing overall. Now, let's go back to the threshold a little bit because I want you to be able to see this. I can adjust my threshold all the way down and listen here. Again, it's really important that you use your ears to hear what these settings are doing because you're going to have to tweak them for your particular situation, and using your ears is how you can tell where they should be for your situation. Watch what happens when I pull this threshold way down. That means that it's going to catch almost all of the audio coming through the compressor. Okay, I now have it set to minus 49 dB. Oh my goodness. Let's go to minus 35 dB. Look what it's doing visually and listen to what it sounds like. Sounds pretty awful, right? I'm compressing the heck out of this audio. Definitely we don't want to do that. Now, if I bring it all the way up to 0 dB, it's not doing any compression whatsoever. So obviously we don't want it there, but I can kind of just bring this down a little bit until I start to see the compressor engaging just a little bit. So watch what happens. So here we're at, that was a little too much, so I'm backing off. I'm about minus 24 dB, checking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's about where I want it, where it's just doing a little bit of compression, maybe on every other syllable, something like that, and just a little bit, not a lot. So I could probably even back off a little bit if I wanted to be a bit more subtle, maybe go to minus 23. So that's what it looks like at minus 23. And just for illustration, I probably want to go to minus 24. There we go. Okay. So we're just doing a little bit of compression, as you can see by the red indicator there. Okay. Again, for ratio, generally about 3:1 for dialogue. I don't want it to go super heavy. Watch what happens when I go super heavy on the threshold, or sorry, the ratio. So checking 1, 2, 3. And to hear this, I might need to drop my threshold just a little bit more so it engages more, and then I'll bring it back up. So I'm going to drop this maybe down to 30. Now, can you hear that difference? It's very different. Wow. You may have to adjust your volume, but that's not sounding very natural to me for a couple reasons. The compressor threshold is set too low, and the ratio is way too crazy. But while we still have that threshold a little bit lower, let's back off of this compression ratio. Let's go to 2:1. So now you can see it's kicking in almost constantly, but it's not doing a whole lot of compression. So that's a little bit better. But generally, again, for dialogue, about 3:1. Get that dialed in. These settings are on a touchscreen are a little bit touchy. Getting exactly 3:1 is a tricky proposition. We'll go with 3.3:1. How about that? And I'm going to pull this threshold back up, about 24, roughly there. Okay. So that's where we want to be again. I'm going to go ahead and turn my volume down just a little bit. All right, so we're pretty good there. Next up, let's talk about attack and release together, actually. Now, what the attack defines is that once the audio gets above this threshold that we've set, the attack is how long it takes before the compressor is doing this amount of compression, the compression ratio. So what happens is, as the audio exceeds the threshold, it doesn't immediately go to a 3:1 compression ratio. It takes into account the attack, and it takes that long before it gets to a 3:1 compression ratio. So it kind of starts to compress a little bit more gently first, and then it takes up to, in this case, 5 milliseconds before it's compressing to a full 3:1 ratio. So I guess that's bugging me. A little OCD here. 3.1, that's closer. All right, so 5 milliseconds. So what does this sound like if we use a different attack? What if we use a really fast attack? Let's go ahead and drop that down. Okay, there's a fast attack. Let's go the fastest we can go. There's a 0.1 millisecond compression attack. And generally what you're going to find is that a very fast attack on dialogue is going to start to sound a little bit less natural. It's going to start sounding a little bit more aggressive. And so we generally don't want that for dialogue because we want it to sound fairly natural. Now watch what happens too if I slow this attack way down. If I slow it down to 10 milliseconds, you can see here now it's actually not even compressing as much because what's happening is it's now giving it a full 10 milliseconds to get up to that compression ratio. So even if the audio, those little transient peaks, get above minus 24 dB, it's giving a full 10 milliseconds before it is getting to this 3:1 compression ratio. So it ends up doing a little bit less compression actually. So that is what that's not a really long attack. And actually in music, most compressors will allow you to go much higher than that. But what I generally find for most voices, somewhere in the 5 millisecond range is going to work pretty nicely for this particular compressor and for most voices. But kind of tweak it. Again, use your ears here to really kind of tune this in and get it where you feel like it's controlling the big peaks, but it's also not starting to sound really, really unnatural. We could actually even back off of that a little bit more, I think, to my ears, at least. So there we go. All right, next is release. Now, release is what happens or how long it takes after the audio dips back below the threshold before it stops compressing. Okay, now let's go ahead and crank that up. Here's a really fast release, and you can see what happens is it lets go of the compression really quickly. And that could start to sound a little bit unusual if we kind of drop our threshold again just for the purposes of hearing what this sounds like. Okay, so it lets go really, really quickly, and it kind of, it doesn't sound great. Can you hear that? I hope you can hear that. So let's pull that off. So we're going to pull that back some. And then if we go too long, we can go as far as 2 seconds, 2 full seconds of release. It kind of sounds a little weird there too, because what it does, it continues to compress for 2 full seconds after the audio dips back below the threshold. Okay, and that's a little bit problematic as well. I find that for dialogue, somewhere in maybe the 0.25 to 0.3, somewhere in there is going to sound a little bit more natural for most circumstances. So go ahead again and tweak that until you find something that sounds pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull this threshold back up. All right, there we are back at about -24. Okay, so now interestingly is once we've done this compression, we've actually pulled those peaks down some. Now the question becomes, how do we make it louder? Because we've done all that work to get those peaks down, now we want to make it a little bit louder, so what do? Well, that's where our gain comes in. This is basically what is often called makeup gain, and we can apply a different amount. So I'm going to drop this. You'll notice the levels will get not as loud in your headphones. So there we go. So there's no makeup gain applied. So all we're doing is reducing the gain on the peaks here using the compressor. But if I wanted to overall get the louder levels, what I would generally do is pop back out to the main meters here. And let's look at where we're peaking. We're peaking at about -12, maybe -10. So we could apply a good bit of gain here to get our levels overall louder. And we're going to be safe because, again, we're doing this compression, so we shouldn't be bumping up against 0 dB. So I've applied 5 dB of makeup gain. Let's pop back out. Now you can see we're peaking a little bit closer to 0 dB. So this is going to be a nice, healthy level for your audience. And that is a look at the overall compressor settings on the new version 2.1 firmware on the Rodecaster Pro. I hope that was helpful for you. I hope that makes it so that you can make better recordings for your podcasts and for your live streams and whatever else you're recording with the Rodecaster. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you have not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.